Hi everyone and welcome to AXA Coral Live. We've got a great live lesson for you today. We're talking about human activity and the coral reef. Now yesterday we had a live lesson that's available on Catch Up, which was an introduction to the coral reef and the coral ecosystem. We might reference some of those basics during today's lesson, so do go and have a look at that at a later date if you need to sort of brush up on that knowledge. But it's my great delight that we can connect directly to Dr. Mark Vermeer, who is Science Director at the Kamabi Research Station in Curacao. Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon. Good morning, actually, almost.
Good morning. Wonderful to have you with us. You've been the wonderful host of Coral Live over the past years, and this year, for obvious reasons, we are fully virtual. But for this lesson on human activity and the coral reef, we have some shout outs to give. We've got welcoming students from Bradfield College, Felsted School, and King Edward VI College, all tuning in to learn about coral science. This lesson focused for students at sort of A-level age, and also if you're a very keen bean at GCSE, we hope you enjoy this lesson too. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping in terms of interaction. Now, there are two ways that you can send us questions during this talk. The first is using the YouTube live chat. That is the sort of bar next to the video viewer. You may have this full screen. If so, then use a secondary device, a mobile phone or tablet. And you will need to have a YouTube account to be able to send us questions. Those will come through to Sim, who's moderating this live lesson, and then they'll zip that over to myself and Mark, and we'll get to those. The second method is there's a speech bubble, white speech bubble in the bottom right-hand corner of the Encounter EDU website, and that's encounteredu.com. And you can, again, click on there, come through to Sim, comes to us. Two types of questions. If there's something you don't quite understand, if there's a clarification you're after, we'll try and get to those questions during the live lesson. If it's sort of wider discussion, we'll hold those questions to the end where we have a Q&A segment. But before we get into the topic itself, Mark, you're at the Kamabi Research Station, you're Science Director. What is a field station and what is your role there? What does a Science Director do?
So what I'm trying to do here is to sort of create the conditions that people that want to study coral reefs, like the one behind you, and so they have the place to do it. Like it used to be in the past that people, if they wanted to go study coral reefs, they had to put everything in suitcases, move somewhere else, sleep in a tent, that sort of thing. But now that we know that there's like so much stories you can get from coral reefs, it's easier if people can stay longer, that there's the facilities to also do microbial and genetic research. So all of that combined requires that like places exist where you have a coral reef next by and then a place to work. And those are the field stations. It's to make finding the stories on coral reefs possible.
And aside from what sounds like having sort of, being the driving force behind a sort of hotel for scientists next to a reef, you're also a researcher yourself. Do you have time to get out onto the reef and do your own research aside from supporting other scientists?
I make time for that because like that's the luxury of sort of living next to a coral reef. You can pretty much jump in the water at any time you want. And then the benefit of that is because we're here all year round, is that you can actually pretty much like a walk to the forest, go in, look around. And then if there's something that you see that like, some people have not really seen this, this looks important for certain reasons, that you can pretty much right away start a new research project based on the luxury that you have the time to jump in any moment you want. So actually for that purpose, that's why I sort of jump in. So I don't have to read from books only and learn how coral reefs work, but you can sort of jump in almost daily to go see how it works by yourself.
And I mean, the reef is literally sort of a minute from where you are at the moment. What has, can you give an example of something that sparked your curiosity over the past year or so that you've just seen by chance?
What would be the coolest thing, and this sort of is a nice illustration of how we actually know a lot, but not a lot either about coral reefs, if that makes sense. Is that like here in the Caribbean, there's like 70 coral species, and you would think by now, with that many people talk about coral reefs, we actually know what kind of beasts they are and what they do, but then not really. So for a lot of these species, we don't even know when they reproduce. And the last few years, we've been sort of trying to fill that void by actually, well, we don't know. Let's go jump in at night, because most coral species spawn at night, and just go watch for hours and hours and hours to sort of see what these things do in the first place. So it's almost like, you go somewhere and be the first one to see that there's apples growing on a certain tree and nobody's ever seen it happen before. So that's sort of what it feels like. Sort of these fundamental questions of what it is that corals do and how they live their lives are still out there. And we run into those things a lot of the times. And then even like that example, the most basic of behaviors like reproduction is providing new stories almost every day.
Absolutely amazing. We're focusing in on not just sort of coral biology, but on our relationship, on this human relationship with this ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And when we were sort of preparing this lesson, we sort of looking at this concept of ecosystem goods and services to help us sort of understand that relationship. Could you sort of unpack that concept to begin with, and then we can start applying it to the coral reef?
Yeah, and to illustrate that concept, it's probably easiest to use another ecosystem, because in a way, every ecosystem has goods and services. They're not the same for each ecosystem, but the easiest way to illustrate the point is by looking at a forest, I think. So imagine that you're a person and you don't care about forests at all. Like you rather want to see them gone. You don't like trees. You don't like the animals that live there. Whether trees or forests are there or not, you don't care. But then you need a table and a chair to sit on. And then because the forests are gone, the wood to produce that furniture is no longer there. And that's where you start thinking like, although I don't like forests, they actually do provide certain things that I need. So the things that forests or any other ecosystem for that matter produce, like wood, is a product. It's something that you can touch, that you can sell, turn into something else, and then use. So that's how we depend on those forests for wood. So that's a product that an ecosystem, the forest, provides. Surfaces are often a little vaguer, because like those are things that we sort of take for granted, or that we cannot buy or cannot harvest. And the best thing to think about is, for instance, the oxygen produced by the trees in a forest. I mean, we obviously cannot live without it. And so the fact that we can breathe oxygen is a service, something less visible than a product, that is provided to us by forests. So ecosystem services are the goods and the services that ecosystems provide, wood and oxygen in the case of forests. But then if you look at coral reefs, for instance, they also produce things. And what the reefs produce, for instance, is fish. The more corals you have, the more three-dimensional structure exists on the bottom, and the more fish hang out, which means that you can harvest more, sell them. So it's almost like the same as wood. It's something you can take from a system and then sell it, make money out of it. So that's the goods. The services, like, okay, coral reefs also make oxygen, but a service that coral reefs are really, really known for is the fact that they provide coastal protection. Again, because like corals being made out of limestone, a lot of coral colonies together, a reef is pretty much like a big wall made out of stone underwater. So you can imagine that if during a storm or a hurricane, big waves roll towards shore and they run into a wall first before they jump on land, a lot of that energy, that destructive energy in those waves is then gone. And then similar to that person that doesn't like going into a forest, the person that doesn't like coral reefs will be grateful that his house is still standing there, thanks to that wall that's on the water built by coral reefs. So that's how corals protect onshore infrastructure, buildings on shore. And it's not that you have to go into the water to see it, that service. It's just that if you have a house onshore, that you're benefiting from coral reefs because they're this sort of naturally built wave breaker on the water. And then coastal protection is then a good example of a service, something you cannot really see, provided by reefs.
And Mark, I mean, when we look at this idea of ecosystem goods and services, we're starting to see monetary amounts of assigned to these different goods and services, often in sort of a unit of area, a hectare per year. Is that something useful? Is it useful to put a monetary value on nature?
I think so, and maybe that's mostly because there's a lack of a better alternative. Everybody deals with money, so it's a language that we all speak in a certain way, or at least understand. What people traditionally used to do was they tried to sort of illustrate the beauty or the sort of special nature of coral reefs by enhancing or by sort of focusing on the biodiversity that was there. But you can sort of imagine that if you go to a person and said like, oh, this is really special because there's 526 species living here. Like, is that a lot or not? Like, sure, it's highly biodiverse, but what does that mean and what can I do with it? If you would say that, change that sort of rhetoric for a rhetoric where, hey, if these reefs disappear, the fish disappear, which means that the income of the average fisherman goes down by $1,000 or whatever. Then all at once, people like, oh, now I understand why this reef is important, not because of its biodiversity or what's there, but if it wasn't there, I see people here lose $1,000 each. There's a lot of fishermen, so that starts to add up. So the products that you derive from this system, again, if the forest wasn't there, you cannot sell wood. If reefs weren't there, you cannot sell fish, is something that then is being used rather than biodiversity to illustrate the dependency that people have on these reef systems. And, you know, you cannot say 30 fish, $1,000 is a better way because that's something that people understand. So in a way, by talking about money and putting a money value on these goods and services provided by reefs, very much helps to have people that don't jump in the water, that are not inherently interested in biodiversity, sort of understand the value of these systems.
And a debate that students watching might have later in the classroom or beyond is whether this anthropocentric, this human-centered view of nature is ultimately helpful or unhelpful. I mean, for instance, you know, oxygen, you know, how much money could you put on oxygen provision by a forest?
Well, I mean, if you then sort of take it a scale further, and where does the oxygen come from on the planet? We don't make it. So the fact that basically all humans can stomp around every day is simply because nature is there and makes the oxygen for us. The same you can say about water, fresh water. So you could almost argue that at a global scale, and people are more and more aware that all these things cannot be seen as one forest or one reef here, like especially with the global crisis, like it all turns out to be related. So you would think that if you think at the scale that we actually live our lives together, which is the earth, that the value of nature is infinitely large in the sense that if there wasn't water, fresh water or oxygen, we wouldn't be here. And there you have it. And sort of trying to piecemeal apart and look at like, hey, we could maybe miss this forest or this reef, or we just pay for the value and then we're done with it. We'll replace it by something else. Yeah, that's just not, people then just don't understand how this system actually works. In other words, like if you would do that over and over and over and over again, you would have nothing left, and then we would be without oxygen, water, and we would all die. So I would say, again, it's maybe not the most elegant way to talk about nature, but it for sure has helped a lot to convey to other groups, other than biologists, that they have value. And this is not only for coral reefs, it's for forests and swamps and those other ecosystems as well.
And Mark, I think we have a diagram which was based on some research from 2014, breaking down, I think, an estimated $350,000 per year per hectare of coral reef. It was totaling up, sort of getting up to about $10 trillion. And you've mentioned a couple, and we've got erosion prevention and coastal protection as a sort of the big blue sort of like, slice. We've got that sort of pinky color, almost a corally color, sort of recreation of tourism, which we haven't got into yet. But there's also a couple here which got genetics by them. Is it possible just to talk about, you talked about 526 species in the reef. I mean, reefs are highly biodiverse. Why is that so important for us as humanity?
The way I always try to sort of compare it is like, there is not a whole lot of economic possibilities on, say, islands like this. It's small, it's very tourism dependent, and that's pretty much it. They're too small to do agriculture or livestock or large industry. So it doesn't look like it's a very suitable place to grow or build things. You could almost argue the same thing about the Middle East, where it's all deserts. At the same time, you see that the Middle East has done fairly well because they have oil in the ground, and oil made them rich, and therefore they can do things like grow plants in the desert, which would be unaffordable otherwise. So this sort of shows that, like, if you have a natural resource, and that can be oil or something else, you can actually build up your economy and increase the how do you call it, the welfare level, or whatever you call that in English. And it sort of turns out that the potential for medicine discovery on coral reefs is almost something similar. What that means is that, like, if you want to find the next medicine, the thing against, like, all these diseases that people are suffering from and that we don't have medicines for, but it's quite a lot. Or actually diseases that we have medicines for, but where microbes or pathogens become resistant against a certain antibiotic, so you need new ones in this sort of arms race that we're having with a lot of these pathogens. So you go look for medicines, and if you look for medicines, it's almost like you go somewhere and you have to try so many different things before you actually hit a substance that might qualify to then become a medicine. So what you need is options there. The more you try, the higher the probability that you eventually find a medicine. And this is where the biodiversity sort of comes in. Because, like, if you have a system, say you go to the North Pole, and there's only like 3 sponges living there or whatever, and then, okay, you can try them all. And then, okay, we found nothing. That's it for the North Pole. On coral reefs here, you have like 3,000 species of sponges. So there's way more chances to actually find something. Okay, so then coral reefs being the highest biodiversity animal communities on the planet, to look for a medicine that works for people, us being animals as well, is highest in such areas. So they're dominated by animals in contrast to rainforests, because that's plants. If you look for medicines in plants, the chances that it's going to work for us are way lower than when you go look for medicines in animals. And that's what coral reefs are. So in a way, there's so many different species living on coral reefs. They represent almost like some sort of undiscovered, unopened treasure chest of future medicine, and an open medicine cabinet, if you will. And that makes them very important, especially because, medicines is one of the biggest economies on the planet. I think it's above oil, together with arms trading. So it's a huge economy on the planet. If, say, islands like this could actually benefit from their biodiversity the same way the desert nations, so to speak, have benefited from oil in the ground. And then the nice thing is, oil doesn't grow back reefs. if you don't over harvest them, they will constantly renew themselves. So you can sort of keep trying to explore these medicines, which could then make for an economic boost on these islands that we're unaware of. But that means that like all these economies could actually bring in enough money that you would also need to take care of your coral reefs, and sort of help the island economies in the future.
Incredible to think that, you know, and in contrast to the extractive industries that have taken natural resources, these almost genetic-based sort of natural resource exploitation doesn't necessarily need to, as you say, use up nature. I mean, one of the things that, you know, moving on to another benefit is that many students and teachers watching may have first come across coral reefs in tourism brochures. And I mean, we've got this sort of big slice of the pie here, or almost a third of that being sort of recreation. Is that true in Curacao as well at the moment? But before we get into this biorespecting piece, that, you know, tourism is one of the major benefits of the coral reef.
Oh, for sure, and this happens maybe in ways that are not necessarily straightforward, because the easiest way to think about it is like, I had my family go to the Caribbean somewhere. They went to Jamaica. They never went into the ocean, which is what a lot of people do, because they think they're sharks or something. They just laid on the beach for 2 weeks. So here, whether there's coral reefs on the water, yes or no, it didn't affect them going on their Caribbean vacation. Sure, there's a group of people that wants to go snorkel and dive, but it's a fairly small fraction of the total number of tourists that comes in. But I think it's fair to say that like most of these tourists all go lie on the beach at some point, if not the whole time that they're there. And here's where it sort of becomes interesting, because the beaches that the Caribbean is known for, it's all these white sand beaches, and every beach made out of white sand is made from limestone that was originally produced on a reef. So you have a healthy coral community. Corals produce limestone. Then there's all sorts of animals and plants that sort of break down the limestone into sand that washes ashore. Then you have your beach. So the function of coral reefs goes beyond like just looking at them. No, they actually provide these things, beaches, that we actually maybe value more than coral reefs themselves. And what does that mean? And this is why tourism in large part is dependent on coral reefs, not necessarily because people dive or want to eat fish, but because they all want to lie on a beach. And then if coral reefs weren't there, these beaches would disappear and there would be no beach to lie on. And this has actually happened. Like there are certain Caribbean islands where reef degradation has gotten so bad that they actually see the effects of this, that like there's not enough sand anymore to resupply the beaches. They erode away. And then normally what comes out of the ground is these spiky, gnarly limestone structures. You cannot put a towel on that and go lie around for 2 weeks. And people don't come anymore. So you see that reefs degrade, no more sand is no more beaches is no more tourism. And then since the island economies depend on tourism so much, either directly because of ecotourism, people that want to go dive or just go snorkel, but also indirectly, the fact that these beaches are needed for every tourist sort of means that like if coral reefs disappear, all that money, tourist money, doesn't appear anymore either. And that's why a lot of people now realize like, I don't care about coral reefs. Same as a guy in the forest. I don't care about trees, but I do care about oxygen. Same thing happens with coral reefs. I don't care about corals, but I do care about my beaches. So that's why I want to have corals, despite the fact that I've never put my head in the water. And that's what you start hearing more and more and more. So this dependency of tourism, directly, indirectly, to well-functioning reefs is clearly there.
And does that mean there's a changing attitude or a changing type of tourism as this realization has taken hold, both within communities and within governments?
I think so. And then if you I think what used to be the sort of most common form of vacation back in the days, that people had to work in a mine or had like hard labor, and they just wanted to be gone and relax. And that has resulted that like starting in the, and that's maybe not necessarily the European perspective on vacation, but a lot of Americans come here and they only have 1 or 2 weeks of vacation a year. And you see that the whole tourism infrastructure in the Caribbean was mainly catering to this group. So in the 70s and the 80s, they built these huge hotels that were pretty much only there. So people that had worked the whole year could come and rest, lie on the beach, drink a cocktail, and that was it. Well, those are all things that you do at home nowadays. You throw your phone away and you just relax in your own bed, pretty much, and watch Netflix all the time or whatever. But so the tourism that you see right now is actually people that go somewhere because they want to see something. And that's mostly more the European form of tourism, if you will. And then because they want to go see something, then there has to be something to see. So what you see happening right now is whether it's a government that sort of realizes like, hey, in order to support my economy, I need tourism, but these tourists won't come anymore if there's nothing to see, whether that's a cultural thing or a natural thing such as coral reefs. They have to keep coming because otherwise I get societal issues. There's not enough money coming to our island, making for all sorts of trouble. So you see that both on that level, the government level, as the guys that build hotels. Now also see that like the big towers that were pretty much just to rest are slowly being replaced, and even slowly it goes pretty fast, by eco resorts, small scale, more embedded in nature. So you see that like these groups that in the eyes of a lot of people historically opposed biologists when there was talk about, hey, you have to protect coral reefs, now see, and again for economic reasons, so by expressing the value of reefs in monetary terms, that they sort of join this need or to protect reefs because they also see, hey, if reefs disappear, whatever biologists say doesn't matter, but my beach is gone, my tourists won't come, and that's going to have economic consequences that I don't want, and therefore let's go do something about it. So you see an alignment happening of those that have argued for the protection of reefs from a biological reason in the past, that those are now being joined by governments and private companies. That something is indeed something we should do sooner than later.
Mark, you may be in the middle of discussions at the moment and so can't talk about them, but other examples from Curacao where you have formed better partnerships with the tourism sector to better align joint ambitions?
There's actually a lot happening, and so there's a lot of examples to pick from. One, for instance, is the fact that several of the bigger hotels here on the island have expressed interest to sort of be more environmentally aware when they build their new, more eco-friendly hotels, so small little houses scattered around their terrain, instead of these big towers or heavily developed coasts. But for that, the zoning plans of the island have to be changed, and we're trying to help them with that. Because they're like, I'm not going to build my eco-resort here, and then there's another sort of tourism area next door where somebody could theoretically build a tower that's 12 stories high, one of these old hotels from the 80s, so to speak. So what they want is like, okay, we want to go eco-friendly, but then these high-use zones have to be downscale. So what I want to do fits into the wider context, and the people that are going to visit my hotel won't be affected by this sort of polluted landscape where people still building these big hotels. So you see that there's a desire to sort of downscale in what's possible, and that desire comes from the fact that people realize that like the pressure on these natural resources should be lower, so everybody can enjoy them sustainably, or at least for more than 5 years, and not, okay, we're going to do that. And it's similar to these islands that have seen their beaches disappear. You just go for a while, and then that's the end of it. Your resources gone, your reefs are gone, your beaches are gone. No, that should not happen. But for that to happen, we should probably build in lower concentrations, less dense. And for that, like the whole way the island is zoned needs to be changed, but they're willing to go there, which is sort of unusual if you contrast it with how it used to go last 3 decades. But also, for instance, the fishermen, so developers is one example. Like I said earlier, it doesn't make much sense to go argue with fishermen here about fish because they know a lot about them. And they also know that there is less now than there were in the past. So what usually happens when the nature movement, if you will, joins a conversation like this is that they accuse fishermen of like, hey, you guys took all the fish out. You're stupid. You shouldn't have done this. It's all you to blame that reef fish communities are not what they used to be. These fishermen know that. The reason why they're become uncooperative is because people start yelling at them. If you just go work with them, it's like, okay, well, we all know this already. I mean, you don't have to talk about it. There's nobody that's going to say that there's, in places like this, more fish now than there used to be in the past. But okay, we all know that if you set 30% of your coast aside and don't fish there anymore, that in 10, 15 years, your fish population rebounds to the degree that it actually starts overflowing in areas where there's fishing still going on, which actually leads to more fish being caught. So instead of arguing, let's go decide where we're going to make these zones, and everybody has to sort of say in it. And that happened. And then boom, within 2 months, there were no fishing zones around Curacao. Whereas normally that takes like 15 years of arguing between science people and fishermen.
So and that's happened now. That's happened recently.
Yeah, it has happened. There's a Council of Ministers meeting going on actually right now, where they're probably going to approve it.
That's amazing news, fantastic news. So we've got this sort of summary, and I think we've got a slide for this of the uses of coral reefs to humans. We've got that coastal protection aspect. We've got tourism. We've got science research, obviously, food through fishing, and that very exciting sort of new frontier of medicines. Turning, sort of looking at some of the impacts that people have had on the coral reef over the years, you see a turning point. But just to sort of mention one, sort of without sort of pointing fingers, because I know it's often a sort of a complex issue, but what have you seen, or what do you know has happened to the fish on the reef over the past, I don't know, however long?
You see those disappear, and an example to illustrate that was that even 50, 60 years ago, like a reef was pretty much seen as a warehouse where somebody would literally jump out of his house, ask like, hey, what do I have to bring? 2 lobsters, a conch, and 3 parrotfish. You would jump in the water, shoot them with a spear gun, and be back half an hour later. If you see that now, like people have to spend the whole day on the ocean to catch a third of that nowadays. So based on the sort of effort you have to do to bring something back, you can easily see it's all still there, but it just takes a longer time to find it. And so that is indicative that like this whole supermarket idea, those days are over. At the same time, people still think of the ocean as a supermarket. So because the idea still exists, people keep treating it as such, which means that like the means to catch stuff become more effective. So in the past, people would just with a simple hook and line catch the things that they need. And now they have to roll out a gill net that's 500 meters long to catch the same thing. So the effort has to go up to catch the same as back in the day. And then if you sort of compare catches with the effort you have to do, you see it go bad. And especially because it's illegal here in Curacao, but it happens when people start unrolling these huge gill nets that you can buy for $200. These very efficient forms of fishing arise to basically dip net out the last remaining individuals of a certain species. So that's sort of worrisome. At the same time, and this experiment is sort of done in other places where people have allocated no-take zones. If you do it in time, and it sort of looks like most Caribbean islands still have that time, if you do it now, you can see the benefits 10, 15 years from now. So it's about time that it happens, but it's not too late yet to sort of give up altogether.
And just taking an ecosystem point of view, it's not just about individual species disappearing. I mean, what's the relationship between, say, reef health and fishing out sharks or fishing out herbivores on the reef?
That's funny because we just finished a study on Aruba that sort of dealt with this. Like Aruba is way more dependent on tourism than Curacao is. And the thing that we saw to illustrate is sort of all the elements of that ecosystem matter. And the simplest way to maybe illustrate that is to think about the abundance of algae. Like on a healthy coral reef, you hardly see any algae. There are things that actually look like plants, not the algae that live inside corals. Those are fine. But the little plants that grow on reefs, on a healthy reef, you see here one here and there, but not a whole lot. What happens if these things grow because you took out the herbivores or you started throwing nutrients in the water? So more nutrients, less grazing means that they start to bloom. In a lot of cases, like those algae will release a lot of carbon in the water. So that's people might actually recognize that if you put car under certain trees in certain times of the year, that there's like all those little dots on the roof, and it's like some sugar that comes out of these plants. Algae do the same thing. And then if they release all the sugar in the water, there's going to be something that eats it, and that's microbes. But the microbes that are sugar eaters, so to speak, are not the nicest ones, so to speak. And a lot of them can even be pathogenic. So you see that if you take out the herbivores, add in more nutrients, you get more algae. More algae means more sugar in the water. More sugar in the water means more microbes. More microbes mean that there's also going to be more pathogens, which means that corals get sick, fish get sick, and even people get sick. So that's another thing. Like these reefs, you better keep them in the way they are, because if they degrade and they become these sort of rotting algae fields where the water became unclear because there's so much microbes in the water, and this has happened in a lot of places in the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world, you get this replacement system, which is sort of full with microbes, and that means that nobody can go in the water anymore in a way, because you might actually get sick. So almost like, hey, protect your reefs, because if it's not a reef, you're going to get this instead, a system that will basically not make it fun to jump in the water, because you might actually get sick. So human health issues is almost another reason that you could sort of add to the importance of reefs, where reefs then are seen as sort of the more preferred system of what your coastal ecosystems look like compared to this algal, rotten, microbial state.
And just looking at the sort of general sort of overview of threats to coral reefs, I think we've got a slide for this. We've covered sort of coastal development and making sure there's no sort of damage to reefs, sort of overfishing. I mean, storm damage is just a natural sort of cycle of how reefs can be damaged. One of the things we haven't covered, and these are all sort of what I would call sort of local impacts. One of the things we haven't covered is that these bigger stresses caused by increased carbon emissions. How are those affecting the reef?
Like the carbon emissions obviously make for warming waters. The problem there in the context of coral reefs is that like this cohabitation, if you will, of the coral animal and its like algal symbiont breaks down at that point. When seawater temperature rises, the algae that live inside corals start making certain molecules that corals don't like. And in order to prevent that from happening, they throw out the algae. So they just kick them out the door. And then the corals don't suffer from the molecules, but the problem is that the corals also depend on these algae for food. So the moment these algae are kicked out, a period of starvation sort of begins. And if that doesn't last long enough and water temperatures go down again, door goes open again, algae are brought back in, they produce food, and the coral survives. But if that period of warm water lasts too long, algae cannot come back, corals starve and starve to the degree where they die. That's the sort of the link between rising water temperatures as a consequence of climate change, how that affects reefs. And that's very frustrating for islands like this, in the sense that the communities here are so small that they sort of marginally contribute to the CO2 in the atmosphere worldwide, but they're the first ones to experience it. And you see that happening in the Pacific, where warming water also means that the water expands. So islands that are often only this much above the sea level start to flood and people have to move. Here we see these coral bleaching events. They call it coral bleaching because these algae that are thrown out normally give corals color. So the whole color, it's gone. And it's really weird. I mean, it's almost like you would walk into a forest and all at once all the leaves fall off all the trees. That's sort of what it would look like, but then from a coral equivalent. And then the third one is that like with the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere, there's a lot of CO2 that makes it into seawater as well, which becomes more acidic as a consequence. And corals being made out of limestone have a hard time calcifying in this sort of surrounding environment that's acidic. So the whole process that makes coral reefs, which is calcification, is being impacted by rising CO2, not only for the corals that are already there through bleaching, but also on the ones that still want to grow, because growing is almost impossible nowadays, or will be impossible in the near future as the acidity of seawater goes even up more.
And you know, lots to talk about there. I think we've got a lesson from Dr. Valerie Chamberlain tomorrow, talking more about some of these impacts and some of the mitigation measures that can be put in. We've got time just for a few questions that have been sent through. The first question is a sort of probably due to an old sort of idea, but of you know, where we have more terrestrial bias. But do tropical rainforests have more biodiversity than coral reefs, or is it the other way around?
It sort of depends where you. It's interesting. I actually honestly think that nobody really knows the answer to that, and so that depends on where you draw the line. And if you were to include all the microbial life, I don't think that people even know what lives in our earballs, for instance. So I find that extremely hard to say. But then if people would argue, and especially taking into account the smaller stuff, that we probably have discovered only 20-30% of the animals and plants that are there, I would believe it. Excuse me. And then with so little discovered, making these sort of estimates of, hey, it's more there or there, it's so hard to do. And that sounds maybe disappointing, but I would say it's actually pretty cool, because that's sort of tying back into this medicine angle that we were talking about earlier. You know, it's pretty much that exploration of biodiversity that is not just like, oh, there's so many bugs on this tree, there's so many bugs on that tree, and there's a new one, cool. No, that's actually finding the candidate species that could actually serve for this discovery of new medicine. So that makes it interesting. And the fact, because you would think that by now the whole world has been explored. Nope, not at all. Like new species, even we find new fish species that are this big every year. So there's still a lot to do, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Mark. We've got time for maybe one or two more questions. This is from Danny Pazmiño in Ecuador, and wondering if the ocean pollution gets to, or warming gets to a really drastic point, what would you do with the last coral reefs, and how could you reproduce them?
What I actually believe is that they're going to do that themselves. Too often people talk about coral reefs as like sort of the glass cabinet, and there's only elephants running around. Sure, especially nowadays, there's a lot of factors from land, overfishing, all that stuff that affect reefs, and they change as a result. because the species that historically did well are now declining in abundance, doesn't mean that that's true for all of them. I mean, it opens up for space for other species. And quite frankly, we see in a lot of places that even now, and even in places where you wouldn't expect it, that corals still grow. So what I think we're seeing in many places, and of course, if it's too bad, it's game over, and your reefs will be gone forever and will be replaced by algae. But rather than a decline, we're actually seeing a change in communities happening. And give that 50 years or 100, we're going to probably see new constellations of reefs that are still reefs. So I actually don't think they're all going to disappear altogether.
And last question. This is from Maya, and it is talking about wastewater. And I suppose that this is probably something we don't think about every day, that whatever we put down the plug hole, if untreated, just ends up in the ocean. How should we be thinking as citizens and communities about our wastewater and the marine environment?
Well, and there is that's an interesting thing, because say on an island like this, which is dry throughout the year for the most part, what is a scarce resource is fresh water. Sewage, in a way, is a source of fresh water. So what an island like this would need is sort of smart ways to get rid of that stigma where sewage water is something you throw the deepest pit you can find, but how to use it. Like, cleaning water is actually not so hard. And you already see this happening, is that people build certain tropical gardens that are nice and at the same time filter water to the degree that the water that comes out in the end is actually drinkable. So by keeping this sort of waste stream on land and use the water that we're short in anyway as a resource rather than a byproduct of society, is the way to go. And for that, first you have to break down the stigma where sewage water is something bad. No, you can actually use it. And again, these examples exist already. And now what you need is some additional smart people that are going to even think of smarter technological options to deal with it. And then have a nice garden and no troubles in the ocean. It almost sounds like a win-win to me.
Thank you. I mean, it's been said in London that if you drink a glass of tap water, it's already been through 19 other bodies, which is quite extraordinary to think about. It's a really, really lovely note to end on. I think for all you watching, thinking about a career in science, thinking about your values and how you value people and planet, that it's not just marine biology that has a role to play in conserving our amazing reef, but also all those other areas of science and research, from wastewater to construction techniques and a host of other avenues. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, ideas, inspiration with those watching. It's been wonderful having you with us on AXA Coral Live. And do please tune in tomorrow when we look at other solutions, both local, global, and then looking at restoration projects as well. So that's at the same time tomorrow. Until then, and a big thank you to Mark again, it's goodbye from Coral Live. Bye-bye.
Bye.